There are some secrets that stay buried until one random shift, one unexpected patient, one moment when your professional life and your hidden past collide with devastating force. What happened when 42-year-old Dr. Marcus Rivera walked onto the Family Feud stage with his wife's family, looking like any other successful physician, was the revelation of what he'd endured during a 12-hour ER shift 6 months earlier, a shift that had started routine and ended with him making life or death decisions for a patient he gradually realized was the son he'd given up for adoption 16 years ago, a child who had no idea the doctor fighting to save his life was his biological father. Marcus stood there trying to smile, trying to be present for this game show his wife had convinced him to do, not knowing that Steve Harvey would ask him about being a doctor, would press him about his most difficult case, would unlock the story Marcus had been carrying in silence for 6 months because he'd signed confidentiality agreements and made promises and didn't know how to speak about the most devastating shift of his career without destroying multiple families, including his own. If you've ever had to maintain professional detachment while your heart was shattering, if you've ever made life or death decisions for someone you loved but couldn't claim, if you've ever walked away from the most important moment of your life because staying would have caused more harm, you need to hear what this doctor did during those 12 hours. Before we begin, if you believe that some sacrifices are invisible but no less devastating, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because we share stories about people who carried impossible secrets, because revealing them would hurt the people they were trying to protect. Marcus Rivera was born in 1982 in Los Angeles to Mexican immigrant parents who worked multiple jobs to keep their family housed and fed. His father was a gardener, his mother cleaned houses, and they had huge dreams for Marcus and his younger sister, dreams that their children would have the opportunities they'd been denied. Marcus was brilliant, graduated high school at 16, got a full scholarship to UCLA, was on track to become the first person in his family to go to college. Then, in the summer before he started college, just after turning 17, Marcus got his girlfriend pregnant. Her name was Amanda, she was 17 too. They'd been dating for a year, and neither of them had any idea how to handle this. Marcus's parents were devastated, saw all their dreams for him collapsing. Amanda's parents were furious, wanted nothing to do with Marcus, blamed him for ruining their daughter's future. Amanda and Marcus briefly talked about getting married, about keeping the baby, but they were 17 years old, about to start college, with no money and no real understanding of what parenthood meant. Amanda's parents pushed hard for adoption, argued that giving the baby to a stable family, who could provide everything, would be the most responsible choice. Marcus's parents, though heartbroken, agreed. At 17, how could Marcus raise a child? How could he afford diapers and formula while attending college? How could Amanda finish her education with an infant? The adoption was arranged through a private agency, a closed adoption that would sever all legal ties. Amanda gave birth in February 1999 to a healthy baby boy, and they held him for 2 hours memorizing his face, and then signed papers giving him to a couple named Robert and Jennifer Mitchell, who desperately wanted a child and could provide everything Marcus and Amanda couldn't. The Mitchells named him Tyler. Marcus went to UCLA 3 weeks later, carrying grief so profound he could barely function, but he pushed through, threw himself into his studies, used the pain as motivation. He'd given his son away so Tyler could have a better life, and the only way to make that sacrifice mean something was to become successful, to prove that the choice had been worth it. Amanda went to a different college, and they lost touch, unable to maintain contact when every interaction reminded them of what they'd lost. Marcus excelled at UCLA, went to medical school at Stanford, specialized in emergency medicine, because he was good under pressure, good at making fast decisions, good at saving people even when the odds were bad. He became an ER doctor, got hired at a major hospital in San Francisco, built a career saving lives. In 2010, he married a woman named Lisa, a teacher, someone kind and stable who knew about Tyler, about the son Marcus had given up, who understood that part of Marcus would always carry that loss. They had 2 children together, daughters born in 2012 and 2014, and Marcus loved them fiercely, was a devoted father, but there was always a shadow, Always the knowledge that somewhere out there was a son he'd never know, a boy who'd be growing up calling someone else Dad. Marcus thought about Tyler on his birthday every year, February 14th, wondered what he looked like, whether he was happy, whether the Mitchells had given him the good life Marcus and Amanda couldn't provide. The adoption was closed, so Marcus had no way to find out, no legal right to contact or information. Tyler was gone and Marcus had to live with that. On November 3, 2023, Marcus started a 12-hour ER shift at San Francisco General Hospital, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., a Friday that was supposed to be routine. The ER was busy as always, the typical mix of heart attacks and car accidents and drug overdoses, and all the chaos that is urban emergency medicine. Around 2 p.m., paramedics brought in a 16-year-old male car accident victim, severe head trauma, unconscious, critical condition. The patient's name was Tyler Mitchell, and when Marcus saw the name on the chart, something in his chest tightened. But Tyler Mitchell was probably a common name, probably a coincidence. The boy was in bad shape, skull fracture, brain swelling, internal bleeding, and Marcus immediately went into doctor mode, pushing aside everything except saving this patient's life. The parents arrived 20 minutes later, Robert and Jennifer Mitchell, both in their 50s, devastated and terrified, asking if their son was going to die. Marcus introduced himself as the attending physician, assured them he was doing everything possible, and escorted them to a private waiting area. He went back to treating Tyler, and something kept nagging at him, something about the parents, about the boy's face even though he was unconscious and badly injured. During a brief break in treatment while Tyler was getting a CT scan, Marcus looked at the intake forms more carefully. Tyler Mitchell, born February 14, 2007. Marcus's son had been born February 14, 2007, but that was still probably coincidence. February 14th was Valentine's Day, lots of babies were born that day. Then Marcus noticed the parents' names Robert and Jennifer Mitchell, both age 55. And suddenly Marcus couldn't breathe, because those were the names of the couple who'd adopted his son. He checked the address on the forms: Berkeley, California. The adoption agency had mentioned the couple lived in the Bay Area. Marcus went to a computer and pulled up Tyler's full medical records, looking for any indication that he was adopted, and there it was in the social history section: patient is adopted, biological parents unknown, closed adoption. Marcus sat down hard in a chair, the reality crashing over him. The 16-year-old patient he was treating, the boy whose life hung in the balance, was his biological son, Tyler. The baby he'd held for 2 hours and then given away 16 years ago was lying in his ER with a traumatic brain injury that might kill him. Marcus couldn't tell anyone. Medical ethics and confidentiality meant he couldn't reveal his connection to the patient. The adoption had been closed, which meant legally Marcus had no rights, no relationship, no claim to Tyler. And even if he wanted to tell the Mitchells, how would that help Tyler? How would revealing that the ER doctor treating their son was his biological father improve Tyler's medical care or provide any benefit to anyone? So Marcus made a decision that would destroy him over the next 10 hours. He would treat Tyler as any other patient, would save his life if possible, and would never tell anyone who he really was. For the next 10 hours, Marcus worked on Tyler. The CT showed severe brain swelling, and Tyler needed emergency surgery to relieve the pressure or he'd die. Marcus consulted with the neurosurgeon, advocated for immediate intervention even though the surgery was risky, and because Marcus pushed so hard, they took Tyler to surgery within the hour. Marcus wasn't the surgeon, but he stayed involved, checking on Tyler's status, coordinating with the surgical team, doing everything he could to maximize Tyler's chances. Between medical interventions, Marcus would look at Tyler's face, seeing echoes of himself, of Amanda, of the baby they'd created when they were too young to keep him. He saw Tyler's whole life in the patient records: childhood illnesses, sports injuries, the history of a boy who'd been loved and cared for by the Mitchells. Tyler played soccer, got good grades, wanted to study engineering. He'd had a good life, the life Marcus and Amanda had wanted for him. And now Tyler might die at 16, and Marcus had to use every bit of his skill and knowledge to prevent that, all while pretending he was just the doctor, not the father. Around 9 p.m., Tyler came out of surgery. The neurosurgeon reported that the surgery had gone as well as possible given the circumstances, but Tyler was in a medically induced coma, and they wouldn't know the extent of brain damage until he woke up. If he woke up, the next 48 hours would be critical. Marcus updated the Mitchells, and Jennifer Mitchell grabbed his hand and begged him to save her son, said Tyler was everything to them, that they couldn't lose him. And Marcus, his heart breaking, promised he'd do everything possible, never mentioning that Tyler was everything to him too, that this was his son, his first child, the baby he'd given away so Tyler could have parents like the Mitchells who'd love him and give him opportunities. Around 11 p.m., Tyler's condition destabilized. His intracranial pressure was rising again, indicating more swelling, and he was heading toward a fatal brain herniation if they didn't act immediately. The neurosurgeon was in another surgery and couldn't get there for 20 minutes, and Tyler didn't have 20 minutes. Marcus had to make a decision: wait for the neurosurgeon and risk Tyler dying, or perform an emergency procedure himself that he was technically qualified to do but wasn't his specialty, and if he made a mistake Tyler could die or be permanently brain damaged. Marcus had to decide whether to risk his son's life by acting or risk his son's life by waiting. He decided to act. He performed an emergency ventriculostomy at Tyler's bedside, drilling a hole in Tyler's skull to drain cerebrospinal fluid and relieve the pressure, a procedure that carries enormous risks when done as an emergency in the ICU instead of an operating room. His hands were shaking the entire time, not from lack of skill but from the knowledge that he was operating on his own child, that one wrong move would kill Tyler, that this was his son and he couldn't save him by being the father, but only by being the doctor. The procedure worked. Tyler's pressure decreased, he stabilized, and by the time the neurosurgeon arrived, the crisis had passed. The neurosurgeon praised Marcus for his quick action, said Marcus had saved Tyler's life. Robert and Jennifer Mitchell, who'd been in the waiting room during all of this, were told their son had been dying and Dr. Rivera had performed an emergency procedure that saved him. They came to find Marcus at 1 a.m., crying and grateful, thanking him over and over for saving Tyler. Jennifer hugged Marcus and said, "You saved my baby, you saved my son," and Marcus, tears running down his own face, said quietly, "I'm just glad he's going to be okay." He couldn't say what he was thinking. Tyler is my son too. I saved my baby too. I did the one thing a father is supposed to do. I protected my child, but I can never tell you that, can never claim him, can never be anything to him except the doctor who happened to be on duty the night he almost died. Marcus's shift ended at 7 a.m., 12 hours after it began, and he transferred Tyler's care to the day shift physician. Tyler was stable, would likely survive, though they wouldn't know for days whether he'd have permanent brain damage. Marcus went home, and when Lisa asked how his shift was, he broke down completely, sobbing in a way she'd never seen, telling her everything, that Tyler had been his patient, that he'd saved his son's life, that he'd held Tyler's life in his hands and made decisions that no father should have to make, and that he'd done it all while pretending to be just the doctor, maintaining professional distance, never telling the Mitchells or Tyler who he really was. Over the following weeks, Marcus checked on Tyler's progress through the hospital records, using his doctor access to see updates, learning that Tyler had woken up from his coma with his cognitive functions intact, that he'd go through months of rehabilitation, but would likely make a full recovery. Marcus never went to see Tyler, never introduced himself, stayed away because he had no right to be there, no role to play in Tyler's recovery beyond the 12 hours when he'd been Tyler's doctor. He saved Tyler's life and then had to walk away, and that walking away was harder than anything Marcus had ever done. The hospital reviewed the emergency ventriculostomy Marcus had performed, and while they acknowledged it saved Tyler's life, they questioned whether Marcus should have waited for the neurosurgeon, whether he'd exceeded his scope of practice, whether there was liability. Marcus was put on administrative leave while they investigated, and for 3 months Marcus couldn't work, sat at home carrying the weight of having saved his son while potentially losing his career for doing so. The investigation eventually concluded that Marcus had acted appropriately given the circumstances, that Tyler would have died if Marcus had waited, and Marcus was cleared to return to work, but the hospital quietly suggested he might want to consider a transfer, that having performed an emergency procedure on a patient, he later couldn't explain his emotional investment and had raised questions about his judgment. By July 2024, Marcus was back at work but haunted by that shift, by the 12 hours when he'd been given a chance to save his son, but couldn't be his father, couldn't claim their relationship, couldn't do anything except treat Tyler as any other patient and then walk away. Lisa, trying to help Marcus process the trauma, suggested they do something normal, something fun, and she applied for Family Feud, thinking maybe a silly game show would give Marcus a break from his grief. They were selected to tape in August 2024. On the day of the taping, August 9, 2024, Marcus still looked haunted, the weight of those 12 hours visible in his eyes if you knew what to look for. Steve Harvey greeted their family warmly, working his way down the line, and when he got to Marcus, he smiled. "And you are?" Marcus managed to smile back. "I'm Marcus Rivera. I'm an emergency room doctor." Steve made an appreciative sound. "ER doctor!" "Man, that's intense work. You must see some crazy things." Marcus nodded. "Every shift is different. You never know what's coming through those doors." Steve, making conversation, asked the question that would open everything. "What's been your most difficult case? The one that really stuck with you?" Marcus's face changed, the careful professional mask slipping, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion he couldn't fully hide. "The most difficult case. Steve, can I tell you something I've never told publicly before?" Steve, immediately sensing this was serious, nodded. "Of course, take your time." Marcus took a breath, looking at his wife who nodded encouragingly, and then he told the truth he'd been carrying. 9 months ago, I worked a 12-hour shift in the ER. A 16-year-old boy came in, car accident, traumatic brain injury, critical condition. I treated him, fought to save his life, performed an emergency procedure at his bedside that could have killed him but was his only chance. The procedure worked, he survived, and I handed him off to the next shift and went home. He paused, tears starting. What I didn't tell anyone, what I couldn't tell anyone, is that halfway through that shift I realized the patient was my biological son. The baby I'd given up for adoption when I was 17. I was saving the life of my own child, and his parents had no idea who I was, and Tyler had no idea who I was, and I had to make life, or death medical decisions for my son while pretending I was just his doctor. The studio went completely silent, everyone frozen in shock. Steve Harvey's face showed he was struggling to process what he'd just heard, his mouth falling open. Marcus continued, the words pouring out after 9 months of silence. For 12 hours, I had to be perfect. I couldn't make decisions based on being his father, I had to make them based on being his doctor. When his brain was swelling, and I had to drill a hole in his skull to save his life, I had to do it knowing that if I made one mistake I'd kill my own son. And I couldn't tell his parents, couldn't tell Tyler when he woke up, couldn't claim any relationship because the adoption was closed and legally I'm not his father. Robert Mitchell is his father, and revealing who I was wouldn't help Tyler, it would just complicate everything. His voice broke completely. I saved my son's life, and then I had to walk away and never see him again, never tell him I was there, never be acknowledged as anything except the doctor who happened to be on duty that night. And that walking away, that was the hardest thing I've ever done. Steve Harvey stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, his face showing devastation and awe and complete emotional overwhelm. After a long moment, he tried to speak but only managed, I can't, I don't. He turned away from the cameras, his hand over his face, and stood with his back to the audience for over a minute, crying, unable to process what he'd just heard. When he finally turned back around, tears running down his face, his voice was shaking. You saved your son's life while pretending to be just his doctor. You drilled a hole in your own child's skull to save him, and if you'd made one mistake you'd have killed him or brain damaged him, and you did all of that without anyone knowing who you really were. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Steve continued, his voice thick with emotion. And then you had to walk away. You saved him and then you had to leave, and he'll never know it was his biological father who fought for him that night. Marcus found his voice, broken and raw. Tyler will grow up, will live his life, will probably never think about the ER doctor from that night, and that's how it should be. Robert and Jennifer Mitchell are his parents. They've loved him for 16 years. They've given him everything I couldn't. My job was to save his life medically, and I did that, and now I have to let him go again just like I let him go when he was born. Steve Harvey sat down right there on the stage floor, unable to stand, his head in his hands. The audience was sobbing, the crew was crying, and Marcus stood there, having finally spoken the truth he'd carried for 9 months, the weight of those 12 hours when he'd been given the chance to save his son, but had to do it in complete secrecy, maintaining professional boundaries while his heart was shattering. Steve finally looked up at Marcus. "How do you live with that? How do you carry that every single day?" Marcus's answer was simple and devastating. "I don't know. I go to work. I save other people's children. I come home to my daughters, and I carry the knowledge that somewhere Tyler is alive because of what I did, and that has to be enough. It has to be enough that he's alive, that he's recovering, that he'll have a full life. Whether he knows I saved him, whether I get acknowledged or thanked or recognized as his father, that doesn't matter. What matters is that Tyler Mitchell is alive." Steve stood up, walked to Marcus, and pulled him into a long hug, both men crying. When Steve pulled back, he addressed the cameras. "I need everyone watching to understand what we just heard. Dr. Marcus Rivera gave his son up for adoption at 17 so that boy could have a better life. 16 years later, by impossible coincidence, that son ended up as his patient, critically injured, dying. And Marcus had to save Tyler's life while pretending he was just the doctor, had to make impossible medical decisions while maintaining perfect professional boundaries, had to be flawless because one mistake would kill his own child, and he did it. He saved Tyler, and then he had to walk away and never tell anyone who he really was. He turned back to Marcus. "You did the hardest thing a father ever has to do, twice. Once when you gave Tyler up so he could have a better life, and once when you saved his life but couldn't claim him, couldn't be acknowledged as his father, had to let the Mitchells continue being his parents while you went back to being the man who gave him away 16 years ago." Marcus wiped his eyes. "I don't feel heroic, Steve. I feel like I got 12 hours with my son and couldn't tell him I was his father. I got to save him but couldn't hold him after, couldn't be there for his recovery, couldn't be anything except the doctor mentioned in his discharge papers." Steve's voice was fierce. "But Tyler is alive because of you. Tyler gets to go to college, fall in love, have a career, have children, have a whole life because his biological father was perfectly positioned to save him when no one else could have. That's not coincidence, Marcus. That's something bigger. You were supposed to be there that night. You were supposed to save him. The game never happened that day. Nobody cared about Family Feud anymore. This story too big, too important, too sacred to follow with trivia questions." Instead, Steve spent over an hour talking with Marcus about the adoption, about the 12-hour shift, about the agony of being Tyler's doctor but not his father, about how Marcus coped with having saved his son but not being able to watch him grow up. The episode aired 6 weeks later with extensive content warnings and framing about the ethical complexities of what viewers were about to hear. It became one of the most watched Family Feud episodes ever, viewed over 400 million times globally, with people around the world moved by Marcus's story of impossible sacrifice and perfect professionalism in the face of devastating personal stakes. The response was overwhelming. Medical ethicists discussed the case, debating whether Marcus should have recused himself once he realized Tyler was his son, whether maintaining professional boundaries while treating your own child was even humanly possible. Adoption organizations talked about the complexity of closed adoptions, about the rights of biological parents versus adoptive parents, about what happens when biology and legality collide. And everywhere, people who'd given children up for adoption or been adopted themselves shared their own stories of loss and longing and impossible relationships. 3 months after the episode aired, Marcus received a letter. It was from Tyler Mitchell, now 17, who'd seen the Family Feud episode and recognized his own story. Tyler had asked his parents about the doctor who'd saved him, had learned his name was Dr. Marcus Rivera, and had put the pieces together. The letter said simply, "Dr. Rivera, I saw you on Family Feud. I know you're my biological father. I know you saved my life. I want to meet you. Not to replace my dad, but to know you, to thank you, to understand where I came from. Please." Marcus read the letter crying, showed it to Lisa, and they talked for hours about what to do. Eventually, Marcus reached out to Robert and Jennifer Mitchell, explained everything, apologized for not telling them during Tyler's hospitalization, and asked if they'd be comfortable with him meeting Tyler. The Mitchells, after their own shock and processing, agreed. They understood that Marcus had given Tyler life twice, once at birth by choosing adoption so Tyler could have a stable family, and once at 17 by saving him in the ER. Tyler deserved to know the man who'd done both those things. Marcus met Tyler for coffee on a Saturday afternoon in December 2024, and it was awkward and emotional and beautiful. Tyler looked so much like Marcus at that age, and they talked for 3 hours about everything, about the adoption, about the night in the ER, about Marcus's life and Tyler's life, and whether they could build some kind of relationship going forward. Tyler was clear Robert Mitchell was his dad, would always be his dad, but Marcus was important too, and Tyler wanted him in his life in whatever capacity made sense. They started meeting monthly, building a relationship that was part father-son, part mentor-mentee, part something that didn't have a name because their situation was so unique. Marcus got to know his son, not as a parent but as someone significant, and while it wasn't the relationship Marcus would have had if he'd raised Tyler, it was something, and something was infinitely better than the nothing he'd had before. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that some sacrifices are invisible but no less profound, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe to our channel because we need more stories like this, stories that acknowledge the impossible positions people find themselves in, stories that show us that love sometimes means doing the right thing even when it costs you everything. Dr. Marcus Rivera gave his son up for adoption at 17 so Tyler could have a better life. 16 years later, he saved that son's life during a 12-hour ER shift, making life or death decisions for his own child while maintaining perfect professional boundaries, never revealing who he was, walking away when the shift ended because being Tyler's doctor was the only role he was allowed to have. When Marcus finally revealed what he'd done during that shift, when Steve Harvey lost it because the weight of that story was too much to carry while pretending to host a game show, we all learned something about sacrifice and love and the impossible choices people make when duty and emotion collide. Marcus saved his son twice and had to walk away twice, and both times it nearly destroyed him, but both times he did it because Tyler's life mattered more than Marcus's pain. That's what a father does, even when nobody knows he's the father. That's the story of what a doctor did during a 12-hour shift, and why he'll carry those 12 hours for the rest of his life.